The people who change your life rarely look like the people the world tells you to admire. I didn't know that the stranger standing in my bakery at 5:12 on a freezing Tuesday morning would prove those words true. Back then, I thought he was just another customer escaping the cold before sunrise. I had no idea the entire city whispered his name with equal parts respect and fear. My name is Emily Carter, and every morning begins long before most people remember the world exists. While Manhattan sleeps beneath glowing skyscrapers and silent penthouses, I unlock the weathered front door of Carter's Bakery with flour already dusting my jeans and the smell of butter clinging to my sweater. My grandmother used to say that bread listens to your heart. If you knead it with anger, it turns stubborn. If you knead it with love, people can taste the difference without knowing why. I never argued with her. 20 years later, I still whispered good morning to every batch of dough before sliding it onto the worn maple table she'd left me. Maybe it sounded ridiculous. Maybe it was. But that tiny ritual had carried me through every difficult season of my life. The ovens warmed slowly, filling the quiet shop with soft golden light, while cinnamon drifted through the air like an old memory. Outside, snow rested along the sidewalks, untouched except for the occasional taxi splashing through slush. Inside, everything felt safe, predictable, honest. I preferred flour under my fingernails over expensive jewelry. I preferred the sound of timers ringing instead of champagne glasses clinking in luxury ballrooms. People online like to say women should become the best version of themselves. Usually that meant losing weight, buying designer clothes, changing their hair, fixing every inch of themselves until strangers approved. I had tried chasing approval once. It was exhausting. Somewhere along the way, I realized fresh bread never judged the hands that made it. Customers sometimes did. There were mornings when women in perfect coats looked me up and down before asking if the owner was available, surprised to discover I was standing right in front of them. Some smiled politely after, realizing their mistake. Others didn't bother hiding their disappointment. I learned to smile anyway. Kindness costs less than resentment. At exactly 6:03, the bell above the front door chimed once. The sound barely echoed before cold winter air slipped inside. I looked up automatically, expecting one of my regular construction workers grabbing coffee before work. Instead, a tall man stepped through the doorway wearing a charcoal wool coat tailored so perfectly it looked sculpted rather than stitched. Snowflakes rested briefly on his dark hair before melting into tiny drops. He removed black leather gloves with slow, deliberate movements, his expression calm enough to make the entire room feel quieter. There was nothing flashy about him. No loud watch. No oversized smile. Just quiet confidence that seemed strangely out of place inside my little neighborhood bakery. His eyes wandered across the display case filled with cinnamon rolls, sourdough loaves, blueberry muffins, and the apple pie I'd finished less than 15 minutes earlier. For reasons I couldn't explain, I suddenly hoped the crust had baked evenly. "Good morning," I said with the same smile I gave every customer. "What can I get started for you?" He looked at me for a long second, not in the uncomfortable way some men stared, but as though he was genuinely seeing me instead of simply looking. Then the corners of his mouth lifted almost imperceptibly. "I'll take the last apple pie," he said in a low, steady voice. "And whatever you recommend for someone who hasn't had breakfast in 2 days." I smiled before I could stop myself. There was something unexpectedly honest about the way he admitted that, as though hunger was simply another fact instead of something to hide behind pride. Most customers apologized for taking my last pie. He sounded almost apologetic for missing breakfast. "Then you need more than dessert," I said, already reaching for a fresh sourdough roll cooling on the rack behind me. "Give me 2 minutes." He nodded without checking his phone, without glancing impatiently at an expensive watch, without acting as though his time mattered more than mine. That alone made him different. I sliced the warm roll, spread real butter that melted instantly into the soft bread, layered scrambled eggs, smoked turkey, sharp cheddar, and a handful of fresh spinach before wrapping everything in butcher paper. Then I added a cinnamon roll because nobody should face a New York winter on an empty stomach. "That should keep you going for a while," I said as I placed everything beside the apple pie. He studied the food for a moment before looking back at me. "You always decide what your customers need. Only when they admit they have not eaten in 2 days." The faint smile returned, just enough to soften the sharp lines of his face. It made him look younger, although something in his eyes still carried the weight of someone used to responsibility. He reached for his wallet, and I noticed it was handmade leather, worn carefully rather than replaced. "How much?" he asked. I totaled everything and told him the price. He slid several $100 bills across the counter without even counting them. I blinked before pushing all but one bill back toward him. "That is too much. Keep the change." I laughed quietly. "Sir, the change would pay my electric bill for a month. Perhaps your bakery deserves a good month." I shook my head. "And perhaps you deserve someone honest enough to give your money back." For the first time since he walked in, he looked genuinely surprised. Not offended. Surprised. Like people rarely disagreed with him. "You are refusing extra money?" "I am refusing money that does not belong to me." I slid the bills closer to him again. "My grandmother taught me that every loaf carries the reputation of the baker who made it. I would rather earn another customer than take another dollar." The bakery fell quiet except for the gentle hum of the ovens and the steady tapping of snow against the front windows. He never reached for the money immediately. Instead, he kept watching me with an expression I could not quite understand. Finally, he folded the extra bills back into his wallet. "Then I suppose I owe your grandmother my compliments. She would probably tell you that the cinnamon roll needs 5 more minutes to cool before eating it." His eyes drifted toward the framed photograph hanging beside the coffee machine. My grandmother stood there wearing a flower-covered apron, laughing with a rolling pin in one hand. "She looks proud," he said softly. "She built this place with my grandfather after the war," I answered. "Everything here still belongs to them in some way." He nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully, before lifting the bakery box containing the pie. "Then I will make sure nothing goes to waste." As he turned toward the door, the bell chimed again. 3 men entered wearing tailored coats dark enough to match the winter sky. The moment they noticed him, they stopped speaking. One of them lowered his head respectfully before saying, "Sir, the car is ready. We are already running behind for the foundation meeting." I froze with a coffee pot still in my hand. The man simply gave a small nod without taking his eyes off me. Tell them 5 more minutes was worth the delay. None of the 3 argued. They stepped back outside into the snow without another word, leaving me standing behind the counter wondering who in the world needed 3 men to wait outside while he bought breakfast from a neighborhood bakery. The rest of that morning refused to leave my mind. Customers came and went in their usual rhythm. Office workers grabbed coffee on their way downtown. A retired couple shared one blueberry muffin every Wednesday, insisting it tasted better that way. A little girl pressed her nose against the display case until her father finally surrendered and bought her a chocolate croissant. Life continued exactly as it always had, but every time the bell above the door rang, some small part of me expected the quiet stranger to return. He never did. Around noon, my best friend and part-time cashier, Sarah Mitchell, arrived carrying 2 oversized cups of coffee from the shop across the street. She stopped halfway through taking off her scarf when she noticed the empty apple pie stand. "Already sold?" she asked. "Before sunrise." "That never happens." I shrugged, pretending it was not unusual. "Someone wanted the last one." She narrowed her eyes at me with the expression she reserved for customers who claimed gluten-free brownies tasted exactly like the originals. "Someone interesting?" "Just different." Sarah laughed. "That means yes." Before I could answer, the television mounted above the refrigerator interrupted the afternoon talk show with a local news update. The volume was low, but the anchor's voice still carried through the bakery. Preparations continue tonight for the Romano Foundation Winter Charity Gala, one of the city's largest fundraising events, expected to raise millions for children's hospitals, culinary scholarships, and neighborhood redevelopment. The screen filled with elegant hotel ballrooms, sparkling chandeliers, and reporters standing outside barricades while photographers adjusted their cameras. Then his face appeared for only a few seconds. The same calm expression, the same dark hair, the same quiet eyes that had studied my bakery as though every loaf mattered. I nearly dropped the tray in my hands. "That is him," I whispered. Sarah looked from the television to me. "Who?" "The customer this morning." She stared at the screen in disbelief. "Emily, that is Dominic Romano." The name meant almost nothing to me. I spent more time measuring flour than reading business magazines. "Should I know who that is?" Sarah blinked twice. "Only if you have somehow avoided every newspaper in New York for the last decade." She lowered her voice even though nobody else was listening. "He owns hotels, restaurants, construction companies, shipping firms, and I do not even know what else. People say every powerful person in the city knows him. I looked back at the television where reporters described him as one of the evening's most anticipated guests. Expensive cars lined the entrance of the Grand Hotel, while fashion commentators discussed celebrities, social media stars, and international models expected to attend. It looked like another universe, one where dresses probably cost more than my yearly rent. I laughed quietly and returned to arranging fresh cookies on the display shelf. Well, at least he liked the pie. Sarah shook her head. Emily, people spend months trying to get 5 minutes with that man. He spent 10 minutes talking about cinnamon rolls. She folded her arms. Exactly why this is strange. I tried to dismiss the feeling, but something lingered long after the news segment ended. Late that afternoon, as sunlight faded behind neighboring buildings, another delivery arrived. It was not flour. It was not butter. It was a cream-colored envelope sealed with dark blue wax, and my full name written across the front in elegant handwriting. There was no return address. Inside rested a single invitation printed on thick ivory paper. Emily Carter, your bakery has been selected to provide dessert for the Romano Foundation Winter Charity Gala this evening. Transportation will arrive at 6 o'clock. We sincerely hope you will accept. My first instinct was to assume the invitation had been delivered to the wrong bakery. I turned the heavy card over twice, searching for another name hidden somewhere between the elegant lettering and the embossed silver crest. There was none. It simply read Emily Carter, as though whoever had sent it knew exactly where to find me. Sarah read the invitation again before looking up with the widest eyes I had ever seen. You have to go. I laughed nervously. Looking like this? Flour still dusted my sleeves. My ponytail had surrendered hours ago. There was cinnamon on my apron and probably butter somewhere in my hair. You own one nice dress, Sarah reminded me. The navy one from your cousin's wedding. That was 4 years ago. Good dresses do not expire. By 5:30, every pie, tart, and pastry that could possibly fit into insulated delivery boxes had been loaded into a polished black van waiting outside the bakery. The driver greeted me politely, helped secure every tray with unbelievable care, and insisted that nothing would be allowed to shift during the drive. Even that surprised me. Most catering companies rushed everything. These people treated apple pies as though they were priceless artwork. During the ride across Manhattan, snow continued falling softly beneath the glowing skyline. Through the window, I watched neighborhoods slowly transform. Small family stores gave way to towering office buildings. Brick sidewalks became polished entrances lined with expensive cars and bright camera flashes. By the time we stopped beneath the grand entrance of the hotel, I felt as though I had crossed into another country without ever leaving New York. Crystal chandeliers glowed behind floor-to-ceiling windows while guests stepped onto a deep red carpet wearing gowns that shimmered beneath television lights. Men adjusted tuxedos that fit perfectly. Women smiled effortlessly as photographers called their names. I quietly slipped through the service entrance carrying a tray of miniature apple tarts, hoping nobody would notice me. Inside, the ballroom looked even more spectacular than it had on television. Gold accents reflected warm light across marble floors. Fresh white roses decorated every table. A string quartet played softly somewhere beyond the crowd. I carefully arranged my desserts beside elaborate cakes created by famous pastry chefs whose names I recognized from magazines. Their displays resembled sculptures. Mine looked simple. Butter, cinnamon, apples, home. One of the event coordinators approached with a clipboard. Miss Carter? Everything arrived perfectly. Mr. Romano specifically requested that your desserts receive the center table. I blinked. Mine? Yes, ma'am. She smiled politely before hurrying away. I looked around, convinced there had been another Emily Carter hiding somewhere nearby. There was not. As guests filled the ballroom, conversations floated through the air like perfume. Fashion designers complimented one another's collections. Influencers posed beneath floral arrangements. Models taller than anyone I had ever seen crossed the room in gowns that looked almost impossible to walk in. I suddenly became very aware of my own reflection in a nearby mirror. My navy dress fit comfortably, but simply. My curves filled it exactly as they always had. I had pinned my hair back as neatly as possible, but beside everyone else, I felt wonderfully ordinary. Then I heard quiet laughter behind me. She is the baker, one elegant voice whispered. I expected someone a little more glamorous. Another answered with a soft chuckle. Perhaps the desserts are better looking than the chef. I pretended not to. Here, my grandmother had always warned me that dignity was measured most clearly when nobody else offered you any. So I straightened another dessert plate, adjusted a linen napkin, and kept smiling. A few moments later, the conversations throughout the ballroom began to fade all on their own. Without anyone making an announcement, people instinctively turned toward the entrance. I followed their gaze. Dominic Romano had just walked into the room. My heart told me to look away. My curiosity refused to listen. Dominic Romano crossed the ballroom with the same calm confidence I had seen inside my bakery that morning, but here everything around him seemed to move differently. Conversations paused without anyone asking them to. Waiters stepped aside instinctively. Business executives interrupted their own discussions just long enough to greet him with respectful nods. It was not the kind of attention celebrities chased. It was quieter than that. He did not demand the room. The room simply adjusted itself around him. I lowered my eyes and focused on straightening another dessert plate, reminding myself that I was here to serve pastries, not to stare at important people. Every few seconds another guest stopped by my display. Some complimented the smell of the apple tarts. Others barely acknowledged me while asking whether the desserts were organic, gluten-free, or imported from Paris. I answered each question with the same polite smile my grandmother had taught me. Good manners belong to the person giving them, not the person receiving them. A group of elegantly dressed women soon gathered beside my table. They looked like they had stepped directly out of a fashion magazine. Perfect makeup, perfect posture, perfect confidence. One of them glanced toward me before whispering loudly enough that whispering no longer mattered. I thought the foundation hired famous pastry chefs. Another shrugged. Maybe this is part of the charity. Soft laughter circled the group. I kept arranging dessert forks. She seems sweet. Another woman added with a sympathetic smile that somehow felt worse than open criticism. But this event is all about presentation. Her eyes traveled from my face to my figure before returning to her champagne glass. Presentation matters. I inhaled slowly. My grandmother used to say that insecurity often dressed itself in expensive clothes. I had never completely understood that lesson until that moment. Their words stung, not because they were new, but because they sounded painfully familiar. I had heard versions of them since middle school, through college, and even from strangers who believed confidence belonged only to certain body types. For one brief second, I considered slipping quietly through the service hallway, leaving the desserts behind, and letting someone else finish the evening. Then I noticed an elderly volunteer struggling to carry a heavy tray of coffee cups across the ballroom. Without thinking, I walked over and lifted half the weight from her arms. "Thank you, dear," she said with a relieved smile. "These old knees are not what they used to be. Neither are my wrists after making 200 pastries." I joked gently. She laughed, and somehow that simple moment steadied me more than any compliment could have. We finished arranging the coffee station together before she squeezed my hand appreciatively. "Your grandmother would be proud of you," she said, noticing the embroidered Carter's Bakery logo on my apron bag. I smiled without realizing my eyes had begun to water. I hope so. When I turned back toward the ballroom, I found Dominic watching from across the room. He was speaking with several donors, yet his attention had drifted toward the coffee station just long enough to witness everything. Our eyes met for only a second. He did not smile. He did not wave. He simply gave the smallest nod, as though acknowledging something important that nobody else had noticed. Before I could look away, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the annual fundraiser. Applause filled the ballroom as sponsors and honored guests were recognized one by one. Finally, the host smiled toward Dominic. "Before dinner begins," he announced warmly, "Mr. Romano has requested to personally recognize one special guest this evening." Hundreds of faces turned toward Dominic as he slowly rose from his chair, adjusted his jacket, and began walking directly in my direction. The room became so quiet that I could hear the distant notes of the string quartet more clearly than my own breathing. Dominic walked with the same measured pace he had used inside my little bakery that morning, except now every camera in the ballroom followed him. I instinctively glanced behind me, convinced there had to be someone more important standing nearby. A celebrity, a philanthropist, one of the world-famous chefs whose desserts looked like museum pieces. There was no one. He stopped only a few feet away from me. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice calm enough that everyone leaned in to hear it. "Would you join me for a moment?" I looked around uncertainly before quietly asking, "Are you speaking to me?" The smallest hint of amusement appeared in his eyes. "I have been speaking to you since 6 o'clock this morning." A ripple of surprised laughter spread through the guests. My cheeks warmed as I carefully stepped away from the dessert table. Hundreds of eyes followed every movement. I wished my hands would stop trembling. Dominic waited until I stood beside him before turning toward the audience. "Many of you have asked me all evening which chef prepared the desserts at the center of this ballroom." Several guests nodded confidently, expecting the answer to be one of the celebrated pastry artists standing nearby. "The answer," Dominic continued, "is Emily Carter." Polite applause filled the room. I smiled awkwardly, hoping that would be the end of it. It was not. He reached toward the dessert table, picked up one of my miniature apple tarts, and held it up just enough for the nearest cameras to see. "This morning I stopped at her bakery before sunrise because I had not eaten in 2 days." Soft murmurs spread through the ballroom. She did not recognize me. She did not know my name. She did not ask what I owned or who I knew. His eyes shifted toward me for a brief second before returning to the crowd. She simply decided that a hungry stranger deserved breakfast. The ballroom remained silent. When I accidentally offered her far more money than the meal cost, she refused every extra dollar. I felt every pair of eyes turning toward me again. She told me she would rather earn another customer than take money that did not belong to her. Dominic paused, letting the words settle naturally instead of forcing them. Integrity is easy to admire in speeches. It is much harder to find when nobody is watching. The silence grew even deeper. Across the room, I noticed several of the women who had quietly mocked me earlier exchanging uncomfortable glances. Dominic continued without raising his voice. "This evening I have heard conversations praising beauty, fashion, influence, and appearances." His tone remained respectful, never accusing. "There is nothing wrong with any of those things. They simply are not the qualities I admire most." He placed the tart back onto the silver tray with remarkable care before looking across the ballroom one final time. "The most beautiful person in this room is the woman who believed honesty was worth more than easy money, who quietly helped an elderly volunteer without expecting applause, and who treats every customer with the same kindness regardless of their name." I felt my heart stop for a single impossible moment. "That woman," he said gently, turning toward me with complete certainty, "is Emily Carter." No one laughed. No one whispered. The ballroom simply stood in stunned silence, as though every assumption they had carried into the evening had suddenly become far heavier than the diamonds around their necks. Applause eventually filled the ballroom, but it sounded different from the polite applause that usually followed expensive donations or rehearsed speeches. This applause carried hesitation at first, then sincerity, as though people were reconsidering something much larger than a single evening. I barely heard any of it. My ears were ringing too loudly. Dominic stepped aside, allowing the evening to continue without lingering in the spotlight. It would have been easy for him to keep speaking, to enjoy the attention, but instead he quietly returned to greeting guests as though nothing extraordinary had happened. I remained beside the dessert table, trying to steady my breathing. Within minutes, people who had completely ignored me earlier suddenly wanted introductions. Television reporters asked whether they could photograph my pastries. Restaurant owners requested business cards. Event organizers complimented recipes they had not even tasted an hour before. Nothing about me had changed. Only the way they looked at me had. That realization felt strangely bittersweet. Sarah had once told me that success often arrived carrying mirrors instead of gifts. People reflected whatever they believed would benefit them most. I smiled politely, answered every question with gratitude, and reminded myself that compliments should never become the foundation of self-worth any more than criticism should. While guests sampled desserts, I noticed Dominic standing near one of the ballroom windows overlooking the snowy skyline. Unlike everyone else, he finally looked tired. Not physically exhausted, but quietly burdened, as though carrying responsibilities nobody else could see. He accepted congratulations with gracious nods, yet never lingered in conversations longer than necessary. For a man surrounded by hundreds of admirers, he somehow appeared remarkably alone. I walked toward the window carrying 2 small dessert plates. "You never tried the cinnamon roll?" I said softly. He looked at the plate and smiled with genuine surprise. I believe someone told me it needed 5 more minutes. It has had almost 12 hours. A quiet laugh escaped him. Then I suppose it is finally safe. We stood beside the window overlooking Manhattan while snow drifted between glowing buildings below. For a few peaceful moments, neither of us spoke. He tasted the cinnamon roll slowly before closing his eyes for just a second. Your grandmother was right, he admitted. It is better this way. She enjoyed being right. I suspect we would have gotten along. His answer made me smile. Then his expression grew thoughtful. Do you know why I asked your bakery to cater tonight? Because you liked the pie? The pie helped. His gaze settled somewhere beyond the city lights. But that is not the real reason. I waited quietly. About 6 years ago, he continued, my mother was recovering from surgery. She insisted on leaving the hospital before anyone recognized her family name. On her way home, she stopped at a neighborhood bakery because she said the smell reminded her of childhood. My heartbeat slowed. I already knew which bakery he meant. She forgot her purse inside the taxi, he said. When she realized she could not pay, the young woman behind the counter packed fresh bread, soup, and apple pie into a box anyway. She told my mother that everyone deserved a warm meal, especially on difficult days. My hands tightened gently around the empty dessert plate. I remembered that afternoon. An older woman with kind eyes had promised she would return the next day to pay. She had. We had spent nearly an hour talking about recipes while waiting for fresh bread to finish baking. She never mentioned her last name. Neither had I. Dominic looked directly at me. She spoke about that kindness for the rest of her life. After she passed away, I visited dozens of bakeries trying to find the woman she described. His voice remained calm, but there was unmistakable warmth behind every word. This morning, when you refused my money, I knew my search was finally over. I could not speak for several seconds. Memories I had completely forgotten drifted back with the smell of fresh bread and chicken soup. I remembered an elegant older woman sitting alone by the front window while snow collected outside. She had apologized over and over for leaving her purse in a taxi, offering to wash dishes if she could not return before closing. I had laughed because my grandmother would have done exactly the same thing. We packed warm bread, soup, apple pie, and 2 cinnamon rolls into a box before insisting she take everything home. The next afternoon, she returned carrying the payment and cash along with handwritten thank you notes for every employee in the bakery. She hugged my grandmother before leaving, and I never saw her again. I never knew who she was, I whispered. Dominic nodded gently. She preferred it that way. His eyes rested on the city lights beyond the glass. She believed kindness counted more when nobody knew your name. A quiet warmth settled between us that had nothing to do with the ballroom or the applause echoing behind us. For the first time all evening, Dominic did not look like one of the most powerful men in New York. He looked like a son remembering someone he deeply loved. She talked about your bakery constantly, he continued. Every holiday she asked whether anyone had found the little shop with the apple pie she could never forget. Life became busy. Business expanded. Time moved faster than I wanted it to. Then she became ill. Before she passed away, she asked me for one promise. He paused just long enough for emotion to settle naturally into the silence. Find the people who still choose kindness when nobody is watching. Never let them believe the world has forgotten them. My eyes filled before I could stop them. You came this morning because of her. I came hoping the bakery still existed. He smiled softly. I left knowing it had never really changed. At that moment, one of the event coordinators approached carefully, carrying a tablet with an anxious expression. Mr. Romano, I apologize for interrupting. Several media outlets are requesting interviews about your remarks tonight. Social media has already begun sharing the story. Dominic glanced at the screen before quietly handing it back. Please thank them. Tell everyone I will not be giving interviews this evening. The coordinator looked surprised. They especially want photographs with Miss Carter. I instinctively stepped backward. Cameras had never interested me. Dominic noticed immediately. Miss Carter has spent the day working, he answered calmly. She deserves to go home when she is ready, not when headlines decide. The coordinator nodded respectfully and disappeared without another question. I looked at him with genuine confusion. You just turned down national publicity. Because you did not ask for it. His answer came so naturally that it almost sounded obvious. Choice matters. Across the ballroom, I noticed several guests watching us curiously, perhaps expecting dramatic announcements or glamorous photographs. Instead, Dominic picked up another small apple tart and quietly took another bite. Still my favorite, he admitted. I laughed. You have only tried two things. Sometimes two things are enough. We began walking slowly toward the dessert table where only a handful of pastries remained. Nearly everything had sold out through charitable donations. Volunteers happily packed the last boxes while guests complimented recipes and asked whether the bakery accepted holiday orders. The atmosphere felt completely different from when I had first arrived. Nobody whispered about appearances anymore. They asked about cinnamon, butter, family recipes, and my grandmother's handwritten cookbook. It was as though one honest conversation had quietly reminded an entire ballroom what truly deserved admiration. As I carefully packed the final empty tray into its carrying case, Dominic looked at me with the same calm expression he had worn that freezing morning before sunrise. Emily, he said softly, if I asked you to help me build something much bigger than a single gala, would you at least consider listening before saying no? I looked at him for a long moment before answering. The old version of me would have immediately searched for reasons to say no. I would have assumed I was not qualified enough, polished enough, confident enough. Somewhere between the bakery before sunrise and this ballroom beneath crystal chandeliers, something had quietly changed. I will listen, I said, but I cannot promise more than that. Dominic smiled with unmistakable relief. That is all I am asking. Over the next several weeks, our conversations rarely took place inside boardrooms or luxury offices. Instead, Dominic visited my bakery before sunrise whenever his schedule allowed. Sometimes he arrived in a tailored overcoat with stacks of paperwork waiting in the car. Sometimes he came looking as though he had not slept nearly enough. Every visit began the same way. Fresh coffee, warm bread, honest conversation. He told me about neighborhoods where families struggled to afford groceries despite working multiple jobs. I shared stories about children who stopped by after school because the bakery always smelled like home. Little by little, an idea took shape between cups of coffee and cooling pie crusts. Instead of opening another luxury restaurant, Dominic proposed creating community bakeries that would hire local workers, teach young people professional baking skills, and provide fresh bread to neighborhood food programs every morning. Your grandmother believed bread could bring people together, he said one snowy morning while watching loaves rise behind the glass oven door. I think she was right. I agreed to help design the training program on one condition. Every bakery had to feel welcoming, regardless of what someone looked like, how much money they earned, or whether they could afford to buy anything that day. Dominic accepted without hesitation. That should never have required a condition, he admitted. 1 year later, the first new bakery opened only 8 blocks from my original shop. Then came another, then another. Newspapers wrote stories about the unexpected partnership. Television stations asked why one of New York's most influential businessmen spent so many mornings carrying flour instead of attending glamorous breakfasts. Dominic always gave the same answer. Success should be measured by the number of lives improved, not the number of headlines collected. People continued asking whether we planned to change my appearance, hire consultants, or create a more fashionable public image. Every suggestion made me smile because the answer never changed. No. I still wore comfortable sweaters dusted with flour. I still tied my hair back the same way every morning. I still greeted every customer personally whenever I could. Dominic never once suggested I become someone else. He simply reminded the world to notice the person I had always been. On the anniversary of that unforgettable gala, we closed the bakery an hour early. Together we drove to a quiet park overlooking the city where my grandmother loved feeding birds every spring. Dominic placed a small paper bag on the bench between us. Inside was a warm cinnamon roll from my own bakery. You finally learned to wait the extra 5 minutes, I teased. He laughed softly. Some lessons deserve repeating. We sat in comfortable silence while evening lights slowly appeared across Manhattan. I realized then that the greatest gift he had ever given me was not recognition, opportunity, or success. It was permission to stop apologizing for taking up space in a world that constantly measured people by appearances instead of character. He could have chosen anyone the city admired. Instead, he chose to honor kindness because it reminded him of home. And I discovered that real love, real respect, and real beauty never begin with what the eyes notice first. They begin with the quiet decisions people make when they believe nobody is watching. The world spent years teaching people to chase perfection. But the people who leave the deepest mark on our lives are almost always the ones who choose compassion first. Because long after beauty fades and applause grows silent, kindness is still the one thing that never goes out of style.